Good morning, everybody, and welcome. We are today going to be addressing the EU Biotech Act, and we're particularly going to explore the impact on what it might mean for patients and particularly early access through clinical trials. My name is Tamsin Rose, and I have the great pleasure to be your moderator today. We have a fantastic set of speakers with real expertise, and we've designed this webinar so that they will give their input, but there will also be a time for you, the participants, to ask questions. So as you're listening to the presentations, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and at the appropriate time, I will open the floor and we'll take some questions from the chat. Now, we are expecting quite a few people to join, and we may not have time to get through all the questions, but we will try to address as many as we can in that time. Now, this event is being recorded and it will be put on the Cancer Patients Europe YouTube channel, so you can watch and rewatch, you can share, and you can disseminate this to your colleagues and people who you think might find this useful. For those of you who are active on social media, we encourage you to use certain hashtags. Could you please use a hashtag CPE or Cancer Patients Europe? And you can also use the hashtag EU Biotech Act. And that way we'll be able to follow the conversations that happen online. So now it gives me great pleasure to pass the floor to Antonella Cardoni, the CEO of Cancer Patients Europe.
Thank you, Tamsin, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of Cancer Patients Europe, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's policy webinar on how can the EU Biotech Act accelerate early access for patients through an improved clinical trials framework. I would like to begin by thanking all of our speakers for joining us today and all of you who are following this discussion online from across Europe. The European Union has set itself an ambitious objective to make Europe a global leader in biotechnology and life sciences. Through the EU Biotech Act, we have an opportunity to strengthen research, encourage innovation, and improve Europe's competitiveness. For patients, however, innovation is never an end in itself. Innovation only matters when it reaches people. It only matters when it leads to earlier diagnosis, more effective treatments, better quality of life, and ultimately better outcomes. This is why today's discussion is so important. Clinical trials are often the first gateway to innovation. For many cancer patients, they represent the first opportunity to access promising new therapies, and in some cases, the only remaining treatment option. Yet, despite important progress in recent years, far too many patients continue to face barriers to participating in clinical research. Across Europe, patients still encounter geographical inequalities, restrictive eligibility criteria, limited awareness of available trials, and practical barriers that make participation difficult or even impossible. Too often, where a patient lives still determines whether they can access innovation. As discussions on Biotech Act began, we therefore have an important opportunity to ask a simple but fundamental question. How can Europe build a biotechnology ecosystem that is not only innovative, but also truly patient-centered? How can we ensure that scientific excellence translates into meaningful opportunities for patients to participate in research? And how can we make sure that innovation reaches every patient, regardless of where they live? So these are not questions that any one stakeholder can answer alone. They require collaboration between policymakers, regulators, researchers, industry, healthcare professionals, and above all, patients themselves. That is precisely why we have brought together such a distinguished group of speakers today. We are delighted to welcome presentations from the European Commission, Parliament, alongside the leaders from academia, industry, and the EU XCT initiative, and importantly, a patient advocate whose lived experience reminds us why these policy discussions matter. At Cancer Patients Europe, we firmly believe that the patients should not simply benefit from innovation. They should help shape innovation. Policies that influence clinical research should be developed with patients, not just for patients. Only then can we build a clinical trial ecosystem that is more inclusive, more accessible, and better reflects the realities of those it is intended to serve. So I hope that today's discussion will help identify practical solutions and inspire continued collaboration as the Biotech Act develops over the coming months. So thank you all once again for joining us. And over to you, Tamsin.
Thank you very much, Antonella. As you have mentioned, it's a really excellent set of speakers that we have who have a real great range of expertise, which is for this really important issue for patients. So now let's pass the floor to the European Commission. We're going to find out more about what's in the Biotech Act, what they proposed, and what they see as challenges and opportunities for patients. So I'm delighted to introduce Edith Shepashi, who is the policy coordinator inside DG Santé, who will help us to take us through that. And of course, she has a PowerPoint presentation that will be made available as part of the other materials. So Edith, let me pass the floor to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak briefly about the Biotech Act to you today. Yes, this is the first slide. As you all know, the Commission adopted the Biotech Act proposal last year, and we very hope that we can have a quick adoption followed by a quick implementation, meaning that we should be able to improve the clinical trial ecosystem in Europe very quickly. Why this is important? Because it is not, the Biotech Act is mostly not about regulation or technical elements, but indeed, as Antonella explained, it is about bringing in innovation and improved treatment to patients in Europe more quickly and with a broader access. And this includes, of course, cancer patients. I took a look at the latest number in the clinical trial information system this morning, and I saw that the overwhelming majority of the trials, 34% of all authorized trials, are cancer trials in the EU. So why it is important that we act, and why it was so important to adopt the Biotech Act with important amendments to the clinical trial regulation is the following. As you can see on this first slide, the EU share of clinical trials decreased dramatically from 18% in 2013 to 9% in 2023. We also noticed that this loss of share is due to the fact that many of the global trials are going to China, which increased its participation from 10% to nearly 30% during the same time. And many of the trials, they remained in the US, whose share remained stable over the same time. So it became very clear that we need to act, and we need to act quickly. Next slide, please. Yes. And this slide reflects very nicely to Antonella's introduction a few minutes ago. So when we took a look at our data, and now with the clinical trial information system, we have information over 13,000 clinical trials submitted under the regulation. We noticed that the number of clinical trials remained more or less the same. In Europe, we have around 200 applications in each month. But what we also see that the biggest part of the clinical trial applications are mononational clinical trials, or they are submitted in 2 to 5 member states. This slide, together with the next slide, please. Yes, shows that we could have many more clinical trials in the EU if we used the unused or underused resources what we have in Europe. This map shows that the participation of the EU member states in clinical trials is uneven. There are a few countries which luckily have high numbers of clinical trials, but there are many others who don't have the same high share. And what we also see on the second map, which shows the number of clinical trials as percent of the population, that even those countries, for example, France, Germany, Spain, who has high numbers of trials, they have untapped population reserves who don't get access to clinical trials. So what we would like to achieve with the Biotech Act, that we increase the number of clinical trials, the absolute number of clinical trials in the EU, and we also have broader coverage across the EU, including additional member states, and increase the number of multinational clinical trials with higher number of participating member states in the coming years. Next slide, please. We also estimated the impact of having higher number of clinical trials in the EU. This slide is a little bit difficult slide, but what it shows that clinical trials matters for multiple aspects. On one hand, of course, they have direct economic impacts. Clinical trials contribute to the economy, they provide jobs, they contribute also to healthcare systems. And what we calculated that even with a modest number of increase, let's say 10%, we could have like close to 4 billion euros of economic gains just from having clinical trials in the EU. If we go up to 30%, which was the situation in Europe like 15 years ago, then the gain would be close to 11 billion euros. They also create jobs with the same level of increase. We could have close to 50,000 additional jobs in Europe, people who are working in hospitals, or they are indirect or in research and development, or indirectly involved in clinical trial related activities. And then I'm coming to the most important point, the impact on public health. When we looked at our information in clinical trial information system, we estimated that around 500,000 patients is recruited in new clinical trials every single year. If we can increase the number of clinical trials by 10 to 30%, we could have an additional 50,000 patients recruited annually in new clinical trials. And we always say that this number is a very, very, very conservative estimate. So we expect that this number would be higher. Also, participation in clinical trial would mean increased access to new treatments for patients by 5 to 10 years earlier, as the new treatment would actually hit the market and become more broadly available. Next slide, please. So in order to improve the situation in clinical trials, we proposed the Biotech Act with a series of amendments to the regulatory framework. We also introduced a key performance indicator to measure the progress and the impact of the legislative changes, and we chose a very simple key performance indicator, which will be the increased number of clinical trials per year in the EU, and we split it further to have additional information on the increased number of multinational clinical trials in the EU once the Biotech Act becomes applicable. This slide shows that we worked on 4 different areas, one for faster, simpler, and more flexible procedures. The second group of changes are related to increased harmonization across the EU. The third one is to help the uptake of innovation and digitalization. And then finally, the fourth group of changes are to help the efficient implementation of all the nice ideas and nice proposals that we have on paper. We thought that legislation in itself doesn't matter if it is not implemented in practice in a manner which will bring tangible, actionable changes for regulators, for sponsors, for patients. I will speak a little bit more detail on the group of changes which are related to bring faster, simple, and more flexible procedures for the authorization and the conduct of clinical trials. I will have one more slide on the shortened timelines. I will explain it a little bit further, but I agree with the scoping paper, which said that shortened timelines in themselves will not bring a solution, but shorter timelines with high standards and simplification can help having more trials in more member states, and then this can be an important contribution to improvements in Europe. So we have shortened timelines, and this will be through cooperation and coordination between member states. We will also include, it's very important, a stronger role for the ethics committees and for the ethical review. On one hand, to have broader harmonization regarding ethical standards across Europe. On the second hand, to ensure that the high standards for patient protections remain the same in the future for patients. We will also introduce a series of changes to make the procedure easier and simpler for regulators and sponsors as well. The second big group of changes will be related to harmonization. Again, this will allow simplification for sponsors, also for investigators, and also for regulators. And then again, in the harmonization chapter, the last bullet point is increased inclusivity. And I think this change is especially relevant for this audience today. What we changed in the proposal is to make the agreement with the new Declaration of Helsinki even stronger, to introduce a shift of paradigm when we make decisions on patient inclusion in clinical trials, basically changing from the current risk of inclusion approach to a risk of exclusion approach, ensuring that patients, including from vulnerable populations, for example, from children, can have access to promising treatment early on through clinical trials. We also introduced a change which will not allow the automatic exclusion of women who become pregnant or start breastfeeding during clinical trial participation. Another important element which is relevant to this audience today is in the innovation and digitalization group. Here we would like to rely on the evolution on the field of digitalization and strengthen decentralized trial elements to allow broader access, especially for patients who has limited mobility or live at more remote parts of Europe. Here we introduce specific measures to support the use of e-consent, also direct to patient shipment of investigational medicinal product. For a patient, for example, receiving cancer treatment, being able to provide electronic consent or receive study medication at home where appropriate can reduce travel, minimize disruption of daily life, and make participation in a clinical trial much easier. Thank you. Next slide, please. Yes, this is the last slide that I have. So here are the numbers that we have on how we would make the procedure faster. I mentioned at the beginning that we are competing for clinical trials with the US and China, for example, who are introducing streamlining procedures to increase the agility of the regulatory system and go fast with authorization procedures. We had to respond to this. We could not maintain the current very long timelines for clinical trial authorizations in the EU. At the moment, we have the maximum timeline is 106 days in the clinical trial regulation. In practice, it is 116 days for multinational trials due to the national holidays, which is much slower than the 30, 60 days that we see in the US, China, UK, Australia. We could not go to the same speed because of the multinational, because of the necessity to coordinate in a multinational setting. But for initial authorization, we have 75 days of procedure, which is now piloted in a pilot called FastEU with the participation of 26 member states, and it is hugely successful. As of next week, we will have the completion of the first 11 clinical trial authorization procedures in the pilot, and it seems to be very successful. At the moment, all the completed procedures managed to reach the target timeline of 70 days for the assessment, which will be 75 days when this includes also the decision step. For substantial modifications, we can go faster. Why substantial modifications are very important? Because addition of new site, for example, to broaden inclusion of patients will require a substantial modification. Extension of the scope of a clinical trial, for example, to include a new patient population, let's say pediatric population, requires a substantial modification. In the future, this can happen much more quickly, so necessary adaptation to the trial with increasing knowledge on the medicine from the ongoing trial will be much quicker, and this will contribute to better inclusion and also increased safety for patients. Finally, with the increased experience that we have with advanced therapeutic medicinal products, we think we will be able to remove the additional 50 days for the assessment of these trials, meaning that we can make Europe more attractive for groundbreaking innovation. I think this was the last slide. Yes, thank you so much. And then just to close the speech, I would like to say that as I said, the Biotech Act provides an opportunity to improve the clinical trial ecosystem in Europe, but again, success will be measured not by putting provisions on paper, but to implement them in real-life practice and indeed increase the number of clinical trials in Europe and increase the access of patients to clinical trials in Europe through multinational clinical trials. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Edith. That was very helpful. You took us through very carefully the different elements in the Biotech Act, and you explained some of the objectives behind it, and you ended it with a clear message to say this is the intention, this is what we hope will be put in place. But of course, it isn't just something that needs to stay on paper. It needs to be living, and we need to see real impact in the life of patients and clinicians. So thank you for that. Now, a piece of legislation is drafted by the European Commission, but it then goes to the two co-legislators, and that's the European Parliament and the member states. So we're now going to have two messages from MEPs that wanted to share their perspectives. And I'm going to start with a brief message from Nikos Papandreou. He is from the S&D group from Greece, and he is a very active member of the Sant Committee, the Public Health Committee at the Parliament. So let's now watch the video message from Nikos Papandreou.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation. It is a pleasure to virtually join this discussion on the European Biotech Act and the future of innovation in healthcare. The Biotech Act represents an important opportunity to strengthen Europe's sovereignty. Innovation, of course, should serve those who need it most, patients. We can claim success only if patients across member states can access new therapies in a timely, equitable, and affordable manner. I think that's quite clear. The Sant Committee, of which I'm a member, aims to create a patient-centered Biotech Act. This will keep patients at the heart of all decisions. We are not done yet. The Biotech Act addresses barriers that continue to limit our potential. For example, clinical research, as you well know, still remains fragmented across member states. Administrative procedures are often complex, and innovators frequently face uncertainty when bringing new technologies to market. Speedier regulatory pathways and shorter administrative procedures across all member states lead to greater efficiency and greater accessibility. We all know that Europe has its outstanding hospitals, great researchers, and top clinicians. However, ultimately, we must streamline the clinical trial process. This will accelerate patient access to innovative therapies and reinforce Europe's sovereignty. Finally, ongoing negotiations are expected to focus on how the Biotech Act will interact with the many existing EU frameworks. For example, the pharmaceutical legislation and health data initiatives are just two examples. As we move forward in implementation of these various acts and regulations, we must smooth out the hiccups, such as duplication and incoherence, and on this, I think we depend a lot on your organization to tell us where we're stuck and where we need to go faster. Policy cannot and should not be made in silos. It must be shaped with those who live its consequences every day. That is why organizations like Cancer Patients Europe matter. And going forward, I would like you to know that at the core of my philosophy is the patients' organizations. They provide my guiding compass, and they must be involved in all phases of my work from A to Z. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that's good to hear that he sees a strong role for patients, and he's willing to work with Cancer Patients Europe amongst other patient organizations to make sure these really important testimonies and messages from the community is integrated into the Parliament's decision making. Now we've got the next video is from Stine Bosse, who is an MEP from the Renew Group from Denmark. And most importantly, she's the rapporteur inside the European Parliament for this piece of legislation. And that means her role is to get all of the different amendments and to negotiate them and to create the final package that can then be voted on by the European Parliament. So let's hear what she has to say.
The upcoming Biotech Act is one of the most important files that I can think of. It really needs to make sure that we will protect the interests of our citizens here in Europe. And as it stands right now, there are many areas where we really need to think twice. First of all, we have for a long time been under attack from China, and now we also see ourselves under attack from the administration of the United States. So we really have to be careful that we maintain our clever and well-educated industry here in Europe, and that is the first and foremost for me to make sure that this will be reality. That is how to protect our citizens in Europe, to make sure that we have a strong, innovative industry in Europe that service us and make sure that we have access to the newest medicines. And when I say we have access, I mean all citizens in Europe. It's not only for some, it has to be for all. And that has to be clearly mirrored in the Biotech Act.
Thank you very much to Stina Bosse for taking the time to highlight again for us how the Parliament sees the important role of maintaining Europe's long traditions and its strengths and its capacities in clinical trials and in the bio-life sciences. So now, as we promised, this is very much a patient-focused webinar. So we're now going to pass to the reality of the experience of patients. And I'm delighted to introduce Jan Rym, who is an Irish chronic lymphocytic leukemia, that's CLL patient. And she's going to share with us a little bit of her experience of being involved in this. So welcome, Jan.
Good morning, Tasman. Thanks for inviting me. It's fantastic to talk to you this morning, particularly as it's the 1st of July and it's a special day for Ireland because we take the European presidency today, and it's really timely to be talking about the Biotech Act.
Excellent, thank you. So as you say, Ireland is in the hot seat. They've just taken over the council presidency. And as I mentioned, this piece of legislation has to be agreed by both the Parliament and the member states. So the Irish government has a real leadership role to help move things forward. But let's focus in a little bit on your personal experience. Tell us a little bit about your personal cancer journey and your experience of access to clinical trials.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I was diagnosed in 2011 with a B-cell cancer called chronic lymphocytic leukemia. And at the time that I was diagnosed, I was young for CLL, and options were very limited. Standard of care was chemoimmunotherapy, and we knew that there was a movement away from that, but it was at a time when there were no other options or alternatives. I became symptomatic of my disease very quickly, and I knew that I had to look at an alternative option to the chemo. And I was very fortunate because I had a very proactive hematologist in my corner in Ireland who acknowledged that he couldn't offer me the targeted therapies there and that I needed to look elsewhere. I needed to look outside of the jurisdiction. And he pointed me and signposted me to, an alternative route to accessing treatments. And that was, for me, that was the UK, that was Leeds, UK. The process took quite a significant amount of time. There were several visits in anticipation of kind of trying to get on the clinical trial. And once I was accepted on the clinical trial, there was a 9-month wait period to get the treatment. During that time, I was really unwell. I had many hospitalizations. I developed issues with my platelets, ITP, issues with my red blood cells, AIHA, lots of infections, neutropenia. And I was prevented to a certain extent from treating some of that because then it may render me ineligible for the clinical trial. So it was a really tricky time for us as a family. The impact, it sounds like a very simple trip going from Dublin to Leeds, but actually when you're so unwell, and I was really unwell at that time, and fatigue was a huge issue for me, that trip was exhausting. And I had, had to consider all of the logistics around that. Thankfully, the clinical trials team, by the time I got there and got on the trial, they were very accommodating and allowed us to stay in the hotel floor of the hospital so that I didn't have to travel twice on the same day. Lots of kind of small accommodations that helped me. In terms of the impact on the family, we at the time, they're all grown now, thankfully, but at the time we had 4 children under 11, lots of logistics with that, ballet, dancing, gymnastics, drama, you name it, people had to bring them. And I was really unwell. So on the day that I started my clinical trial in 2014, so I was 3 years from time of diagnosis to the time of treatment, I had a 96% infiltration of leukemia in my bone marrow. So I was very close to bone marrow failure. And my spleen was so enlarged that I could feel it. I was so exhausted. And, you know, the doctors at the time told me that if I really couldn't have waited much longer at all, I really would have had to take the alternative treatment, which we know would not have offered a cure or even potentially a long remission for my type of disease.
Thank you. I mean, wow, what a story. I'm so pleased that you finally managed to get into the trial, but you described for us not only the paperwork, the timing, but also the reality of what it's like to be really very unwell and then to have to, you know, get things organized. So this is really interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about, you know, what are the key challenges in accessing a clinical trial or an innovative treatment? You said that you had a very proactive hematologist, so your clinician was informed, proactive, etc. But tell us, you know, what are some of the challenges that exist that made it more difficult?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think you're right. And I've count myself as being very fortunate to have had that particular doctor in my corner. And from that very first appointment that I had with him on my initial diagnosis, he was talking about this potential treatment that was out there that would involve oral therapy and not our traditional chemotherapy as had previously been used for the disease. So I did have a kind of an air of optimism, and I completely trusted that we would find a way. But yes, it was really burdensome, administratively burdensome, because at the time, and this was pre-Brexit, you know, there was still an issue with an Irish citizen, you know, accessing a clinical trial in the UK. I didn't have an NHS number, and it was an NHS trial, obviously sponsored by the drug company, but there were still extra costs that we had to absorb. Some of the other challenges were around, it was fantastic that it was an oral therapy, but the eligibility criteria insisted on a lot of tests beforehand, obviously PET scans and bone marrows, and those all had to happen in advance of the start of the trial. So that period of time for traveling for me was particularly unpleasant because I was really quite unwell. And when I started the trial, initially, I believe I was there for maybe a week at the beginning and then allowed to go home, but return a week later. And then eventually the appointments stretched out and it was every 2 weeks, every month. And the good news is I regained functionality. I'm here with you today. It's 12 years later. I'm still on treatment. I still will need more treatment. And I would like the option of innovation, access to innovation in a timely manner. But it has completely changed the trajectory of my disease, given me back years that potentially I may not have had at that time. But I don't want to kind of underplay just quite how difficult it is for patients to take this leap of faith, let's say, to access a treatment that maybe is not standard of care yet. Fortunately for me, I also have a supportive family, a husband who was very proactive in researching and reassuring me that this was a good option for us. And like I say, there was a village of people who were helping us with the logistics, but there was no getting away from the fact that I had to be away from home, away from my children. There was a financial aspect to it all, and it impacted my husband, who was self-employed. He traveled with me on those early visits when I was too unwell to do it myself. So it was a huge monumental event in our lives, and I'm happy to report that it was worthwhile, worth everything. But I would like to think that patients going forward, all patients will have the opportunity to access innovative treatments at home, near their home, where they can stay as functional and lead as normal a life as possible around their treatments.
Thank you very much. That was, again, really helpful to understand some of the key challenges that are addressed by that. Just as a reminder to everyone who's watching, I'm going to go into a panel discussion, and I've got some specific questions for each of my panelists, but then we have reserved 15 minutes for Q&A with your questions from the audience. So please make sure you put your questions in the Q&A function, so then we're able to see them and we'll be able to use them when it comes to that moment. So now let me introduce to you the members of the panel who are going to help us to explore a little bit more about the proposals of the EU Biotech Act. So Jan is, of course, going to stay with us. Thank you, Jan. But also welcome Almaf Spooner from AbbVie, Head of Europe Regulatory Policy and Intelligence. Welcome, Almaf. Pilar de la Rocha, the Vice President for Global Clinical Operations and the Europe Head for B1 Medicines. Welcome to Pilar. I have Denis Lacombe, the CEO of the European Organization for Research and Treatment of Cancer, that's the EORTC. Welcome, Denis. And finally, I have Susan Bhatti, the co-chair of the EU XCT initiative. So welcome, Susan, to my panel. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation that will look at three different elements. The first block of conversation is going to look at Europe's competitiveness in clinical research. Then we're going to look at how we put patients at the center of the clinical trials. And the final conversation is going to look at the EU Biotech Act, how it moves from ambition to real impact. So let's take this very first block of conversation, looking at Europe vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Where do we stand and how do we compare globally? So Denis, I'm going to invite you to look at that, to help us to understand, what is limiting Europe's ability to deliver innovation to patients. We heard from Jan just how important that is and how life-changing it can be. But, what's holding us back? Denis, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you. And of course, I will give a non-commercial clinical trialist perspective. And I would like to take this question starting from actually the white paper that CPE and EORTC have issued after an EU Parliament event last year, where basically the messages, which actually is not only by us, but by many oncologists, is that we don't know how to use innovation. When a drug comes to the market, and we have many examples, often we don't have the dose. We don't know how to use in terms of sequence, in terms of combination, in terms of duration. So that's what we call treatment optimization. And if we doctors, we don't know how to use the drugs, how can they be made accessible efficiently? So basically, there is a claim to stimulate in Europe post-marketing trial, clinical trial that will deliver data sets to document how we have to use innovation. So the message is, of course, we recognize the huge work done by the commercial sector. And the objective is not to delay access to innovation, but to have in place the clinical trials that will tell us how to use this innovation. And the challenge that we have is that the current regulation are not conducive of this trial. The CTR is really written with purely drug development in mind. It does not take into account the specific needs of more public health oriented clinical trial, not aimed at putting a drug on the market, but how to use therapeutic strategy. And I will just give a simple example. You will understand rapidly. We have currently a flagship de-escalation clinical trial in prostate cancer today running at EORTC. This trial was delayed by more than 1 year. And we have published that case, activated under the CTR, costed a lot of money. So basically activated with difficulty according to the highest level of complexity in Europe. The same trial was activated with the lowest level of simplicity in Switzerland. Same trial, same risk, same patient, completely different regulatory environment. So today, indeed, Europe is not competitive to bring these trials efficiently to patients. And I would like to say that actually, and it's not mutually exclusive, but the regulations are very much, and we understand for competitivity, for industry, but it's not mutually exclusive that we think about the patients. And that also the regulation allow this type of trial. Now, looking at the Biotech Act, we are concerned also. We welcome the new definition, but we see that, for instance, what we are very interested for this type of trial, the definition of the low interventional clinical trial to which this de-escalation trial, for instance, belong, is not optimal at this point in time, and maybe I can speak further. You have to stop me. But at this point in time, we welcome the Biotech Act, but it does not go far enough to allow a proper agenda of public health oriented clinical trial for patients in the EU.
Okay. Thank you. And we'll come back to you later to pick up on that. But again, You gave us a very clear example that when you had a clinical trial with the same rules and the same complexity, it was possible to activate it much faster in Switzerland than it was across the EU. And, those are very comparable regimes. So Pilar, let me bring you in now, because we heard from an academic perspective some of the challenges, but from an operational perspective, what factors most influence where global clinical trials are conducted, and how does Europe compare vis-a-vis these other regions?
Yeah, thanks, Tasmin. So from a clinical operations perspective, and I do speak about the commercial side, right? We always look at three main factors, right? So for us, it's very important to focus on speed, right? We also focus on cost, obviously, and the operational burdens that the clinical trial activities may bring. And we're also focused on quality. So when we look at Europe, how do we compare with other regions with regards to speed, cost, and quality, right? So with regards to speed, we've talked about it, right? This is, I think, one of our biggest problems and limitations. 1 year wait for Jan's example, and not only Jan, unfortunately, for a lot of patients, for a trial to actually get up and running is too long, especially in oncology, where time is of essence, right? And the disease can make the patients feel sick very quickly. So I think that the speed piece is very, very important. And as Edith was mentioning or alluding to earlier, other regions in the world can be a lot more competitive than us. And I think speed is a huge component that we should break into several different pieces, because it's not only how fast we can get approved, but like how complex is it and how much effort does it get? Of course, you can see mono country because you go through the simplest possible path in order to go faster. And yet we're still not fast enough. We're not competitive enough. From a cost perspective, for instance, we are comparable and actually quite competitive with regards to other regions in the world, right? Like we are cheaper than the US, so to speak, in order to run clinical trials. Australia is more competitive. Obviously, Asia is more competitive. But I think that there we don't have such a significant disadvantage. That said, and we were talking earlier about inclusivity, I think that there are certain member states that have a certain advantage also from a cost perspective. So when you look at it from an operational perspective, you will tend to go to certain countries versus others, right? And I think from a quality perspective, I think that that's a big win for us, right? So we have the scientific rigor, we have the clinical expertise, we have state-of-the-art hospitals, PIs and KOLs that actually, as Jan was saying, and yes, you were fortunate, and we wish that we would have more patients that fortunate. We have the medical expertise in the region. Is it accessible to everybody? No, that's true. Do we need to do, I think, in my opinion, a bit more work on educating, speaking about what clinical research can actually bring to patients, know what innovation can actually bring to treatments? I think that we certainly need to do more of that. So for us, for instance, right, like, when I simplify it at the highest level, we need to provide regulatory ready data as quickly as possible, so those drugs can be accessed by more patients quicker. And in order to do that, we're going to focus on those three specific buckets in order to be able to actually prepare those submissions as quickly as possible and get those drugs approved to as many patients as we can.
Thank you. Almas, let me bring you in now, because we've heard from a number of different speakers that Europe has world-class science. So the science is here, but the innovative medicines often reach patients more slowly than elsewhere. So can you help us to understand, Almas, what are the regulatory and policy challenges that are contributing to this gap, where we've got the science, we've possibly got the infrastructure, but there are other things that are holding us back?
Thanks so much, Tamsin. And it's a particular pleasure to join today's discussion from Ireland, as you said, Jan, on the first day of the Irish presidency. And I really welcome the opportunity to share AbbVie's perspective, because I think, as you articulated from a patient perspective, there's the reality of how things work in practice compared to maybe how things would work based on a paper review. AbbVie is a global company, and we have a very significant European footprint. We're very proud of our R&D Centre of Excellence in Germany, and we've got 8 R&D hubs across the region. But most importantly, we have 21,000 patients currently enrolled in clinical trials in Europe. And that reaffirms our commitment to supporting early access to innovation, despite the increasing challenges to invest in research in Europe that we're all focused on. Fully agree. Europe has the science, but patients are still waiting too long to benefit. And it's particularly clear in oncology. And I think when you listen to John, you hear delay is not a technical issue, it's a patient issue. So every layer of administration we see, every inconsistent national interpretation, every day lost in startup can mean a later trial opening, slower recruitment, and delayed access to potentially life-changing innovation. Based on our experience within AbbVie, we see significant delays in our European research compared to other regions. The timing for our approvals in Europe lag behind other major countries. 16 weeks in the European Union compared to 9 weeks in the UK, 12 weeks in China, as few as 2 weeks in Japan, and that's based on 2025 data. So with that backdrop, what we're seeing in terms of the global picture is, as many of you have articulated today, and as we've heard from the Commission and MEPs, Europe is no longer globally competitive in attracting trials. Europe's share of global clinical trial activity has gone from 25% to 19% in 10 years. And I think what's particularly disappointing is when we look at oncology, despite the Beating Cancer Plan, oncology trials have fallen consistently since 2021 and are now at below 2018 levels. So I think that the problem statement is very clear. We should acknowledge that efforts have been made with CTR, to introduce a more consistent clinical trial framework than in the past. But in practice, and I think that's the difference, it's not fast enough and it's not predictable enough. And again, this is a Cancer Patient Europe event. For oncology, that matters enormously. Our cancer clinical trials are typically multinational, they're biomarker-driven, adaptive, they're dependent on rapid site activation. So when timelines slip, our implementation is inconsistent across the member states. Patients will wait longer for trials to open and longer for the innovative medicines that reach them. So one of the policy solutions that we really support, and we welcome the Commission's focus on clinical trials in this legislative opportunity for Europe, and welcome the increased ambition articulated by the MEPs today, is that there really should be a focus on a level of ambition around timelines. And from AbbVie's perspective, we would support an even more ambitious target of 60 days for multinational clinical trial authorization. So to go even further in terms of the level of ambition in the Commission proposal. And that particularly matters in oncology. We've heard from Jan what the lived experience of waiting for that trial looks like. If Europe wants to accelerate patient access to innovation, it needs a system that removes these unnecessary delays and delivers decisions within a time frame that matches the urgency of these serious diseases. We've seen, positive signals around a wish to change with announcements like the Fast EU pilot, but we have to be honest, we need solutions at scale. There are 4 applications per month. We need scalable solutions to make the Biotech Act work across the board for patients more broadly. A pilot is not enough to change the reality for patients, so we just need to maintain that level of ambition with the Biotech Act. And the final point I'd like to reinforce, and it was articulated, by a number of colleagues, faster timelines alone won't work unless we get a system, a framework, a way of working that works for countries across the European Union. And that will require a more centralised coordination and administration of clinical trials. So acceleration of the timelines is part of the solution, but we'll also need to see that matched with a more effective system to centralize the coordination and administration of clinical trials. And the Biotech Act really now can determine whether Europe is merely a location where clinical trials are conducted, or whether Europe as a region will really be where the next generation of cancer medicines are developed first. So really looking forward to the further conversation and the shared goal around making this a reality for patients.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And as you said, it's so important to understand what the impact will be for patients. And now our next block of conversation is looking at how patients are at the centre of clinical trials and making sure that innovation actually reaches patients. So Jan, let me bring you back in. From your own experience, what barriers had the greatest impact on your ability to access innovative treatments or clinical trials?
Well, I think, and there are several factors there. I think, as a patient advocate now, I see a huge barrier in simple awareness and signposting of clinical trials. And that's something that I believe we can work together on in a collective way, all stakeholders, including the clinical community and supportive care representatives. So in the first instance, that's there and it's an issue. And then beyond that awareness piece, patients require some reassurance or some support in making the decision to access a clinical trial. So again, I think we're looking there at, the wider ecosystem in terms of supportive care, psychosocial supports. A lot of patients, because for the average layperson, there is an idea or a perception of clinical trials that actually isn't accurate. And I always say this to patients: I was the best of my care I received as a clinical trial participant. I was so well looked after and cared for. But like I say, for kind of patients that I speak to all the time, there is a concern that maybe this is in some way experimental, or they're taking a bigger risk in accessing this treatment. So I think we need to start there in order to make it patient-centric, we need to start there with the patient and reassurance that this is a good treatment for them. And then the level of bureaucracy, not just bureaucracy, medical terminology that is used in the paperwork, in the patient information leaflet. The expectation and the onus is on the patient to understand this. And it's too much, particularly at a time for a patient when they're grappling with a lot of issues and potentially even a psychological toll to their disease. So I think we need to really, really focus on simplifying that kind of information. And that's the role, I know it was mentioned earlier, there is a role for patient organizations here and the wider supportive care stakeholder ecosystem. I think we can work together there. And, again, a lot of helpful information usually comes from a buddy system or a peer-to-peer system where patients hear about someone else who's already gone on a trial, hence I'm here today. And that kind of normalizes things and helps patients. And with them, if they have to travel, we need to be cognizant of the toll that that's taking on the patient, not just physically, but also on everything that's going on at home for them, and the financial toll too. So everything needs to be taken into account there to make this a feasible, accessible option for patients. And ultimately, patients will live longer, be more productive, and society will benefit from it.
Thank you. Susan, we've just heard a little bit from Jan about some of these issues of, feeling concerned about it being very experimental and managing the risk, and the importance of hearing from other people who've been through it to feel reassured. Across the EU XCT initiative, what are the barriers that you are coming across that are preventing patients from accessing clinical trials across borders? And Jan told us a bit about that. And which of these should we prioritise?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Tamsin, and thank you for inviting me today. I just want, first of all, to say the EU XCT initiative is about cross-border access to clinical trials for patients in Europe, because it's not always possible for a patient to access a site in their own country which is conducting a clinical trial on the molecule which may potentially be able to help them. And this was something that we were made aware of largely through patient organizations. And we set up this initiative about 4 years ago. And it's a joint initiative between the European Federation for the Pharmaceutical Industry, FPA, and the EFGCP, which is a non-profit organization. And we have, just to mention this, we now have nearly 150 members in 34 countries. There is a huge interest from patient organizations. We have more patient organizations as members than from any other of the multi-stakeholders who are involved in the initiative. To come to your question, main barriers, they are very well matching exactly what Jan described that she faced. So one of the real barriers is there isn't any information, right? And because there's no information and there's no awareness, there's a huge degree of uncertainty on all sides: the patients, the physicians, the hospitals, even the regulators, the industry, the sponsors. Nobody's sure exactly how to go about getting a patient from one country into a trial in another country. That's one of the main things that our initiative set out to try and do something about. And we did manage to collect quite a lot of information on accessing trials across borders. It is on the EUXCT website for several countries now. I think we've got 12 countries meanwhile, and we are aiming to cover all countries in Europe. However, even for us, and even though we had many industry members and patient associations, we were finding it difficult even ourselves to find that information, because there's very little out there about how to join a trial in another country. So information, yes, absolutely key. Information to patients, information to physicians, and information to sponsors as well. Then another thing that Jan also mentioned is the incredibly high logistical and administrative burden that is involved for the patient, also for their physician, also for the hospital. So there is a lot of paperwork that has to be done. And a lot of that paperwork is to do with who's paying for exactly what part of this treatment. The sponsor, who is quite often commercial but may not be, they might be taking over the cost of the actual trial intervention. But behind that, as Jan mentioned, screening costs, travel expenses, accommodation. Who is paying for all of this? Is it the patient? Who can afford that? Those are things that need to be addressed at a European level. And those are things that we are trying to discuss now, right now, with policymakers and in terms of the Biotech Act as well, because this is not equitable access for patients. I'm sorry, right? Jan, you were lucky. You went from Ireland to UK, English speaking. Try going from Ireland to Germany or France or Spain. You've got another level of complexity, which is you don't speak that language, right? So that is another aspect that we need to think about, and that we need to make easier for patients, and that we need to prepare people on how they're going to deal with it if they want to go to access a trial in another country. And my final point would be on decentralized trial elements. Again, Jan, you said, you know, having to go 2 times a week, travel to when you're incredibly ill, right? Some of this stuff can be done locally. Not everything, of course, right? But some of it, yes. Standard routine measurements, blood tests. We can send the medication to the patient instead of trying to get the medication, you know, the patient to come to the medication. Yeah. Obviously, you need quality controls. You need to make sure that everything is well supervised, that it is safe. But if we can make that easier, less administratively burdensome for everybody concerned, then we can enable better patient access in Europe. I'm convinced.
Great, thank you. So this brings me to the last block of conversation in our panel before I go to the Q&A. So we've got 2 questions that have been submitted already. So I encourage the audience, if you've got a question, please submit it. And here we're going to explore, how we get from the ambition that's in the Biotech Act to the real impact. So Susan, I'm going to start with you. So how could the Biotech Act complement some of the things that you're doing so that we do get a system that's more connected, efficient, and patient-centered clinical trials ecosystem?
Indeed. So we strongly believe that cross-border access for patients should become part of the new Biotech Act. We do not want it to go down into nitty-gritty details, but the actual overall concept of being able to join a trial that is going on in a neighboring country, let's say, should be anchored as something that is available to all patients in Europe. We have the cross-border healthcare directive now in our European legislation, enabling patients to access treatment that's already been approved, right, in a neighboring country. So that is there. It's still not easy, I hasten to add, but at least it's anchored in legislation. Whereas for research, nothing is there. And that is one of the key reasons there is so much uncertainty and why it's always this case-by-case approach, incredibly burdensome, very stressful for patients, potentially life-threatening for patients, by the way. And that's where we need to ensure that this new piece of legislation actually gives patients that kind of access to this research aspect of medicine. Yeah.
Thank you. Denis, let me ask you now how the Biotech Act could help support more innovative trial designs, particularly so that we can build stronger academic research and faster generation of evidence. You talked earlier about the sort of academic environment. What would the Biotech Act bring that would make things easier?
Okay, thank you. First, I would like to react on I would say the comment from Jan and from Susan, because every week I have 3, 4, 5, 6 patients that are contacting me to have access to clinical trial. And we try always to refer them to a center of expertise in their country, outside their country. And indeed, it's extremely complicated. And Pilar said, rightly so, that you make selection when you activate a clinical trial of the countries, of the place you are going to do that. So why? And it's specifically true in an environment like in the non-commercial sector, because we have less means, of course, than the commercial sector. So I think that if we would simplify, and we've mentioned decentralized clinical trial already, if we would simplify the conduct of clinical trial, and if we would have more risk proportionate approaches, I think we would be able to bring more easily the clinical trial to the patient where they are, instead of putting that burden with them. So I think that's the first thing that I think the Biotech Act should be acting. Second, I started answering the first question by referring to the white paper that we did with CPE. I would like to start also by going back to the metrics, which Edith has shared with us at the beginning of this webinar. If you go into more granularity of the CTIS, you will see that the trials which suffer the most are actually the non-commercial clinical trials and the international ones. And again, I want to emphasize the importance of this clinical trial. In an agenda like the ORTC, we change the life of cancer patients. But because these trials are marginalized, today I'm being told they are the minority. Before the CTR, they were not the minority. They have become the minority, and we see that today in the metrics of the CTIS. And this is also a threat for our doctors and our young generation, because you learn a lot on these trials, because they are usually complex clinical trials. And I'm coming to your question, is the fact that, well, it takes 10 years to change a regulation. Science change every year, every 6 months even today. So the type of clinical trials that we are doing actually in a non-commercial environment are going to be a lot sorting the patients and offering different clinical trials and different solutions. So we are talking about trial within cohort. We call that tweaks, trial within cohort based on the registry where you can sort the patients out. Before the CTR, before the change of the regulation, we used to have this complex trial, call them a basket trial, umbrella trial. It has become extremely complicated to do these trials under the new regulation. So I think what we should think is how a regulatory environment can stimulate methodological innovation. It's medical innovation, but it's also methodological innovation because we can answer the question with robust methodology. And I think that is something that is often forgotten. And the last thing I want to say is that coming back, actually, diving to the first question and going back to the example that I have given, you cannot have a regulation that is one size fits all. We have different trials. We have drug development trial. You have phase 1, you have phase 2, you have phase 3. You have public health oriented clinical trial like the one I mentioned, where we try to improve quality of life and decrease toxicity. Today, these trials are very different. The risks are different. You cannot have one size fits all. So that's why we plead for the biotech to have a more proportionate approach of clinical trials so that we can do lower risk trial. And for instance, why, like in Switzerland, this trial would go to part 1? Why don't they go directly to part 2? This is what they do. That's what they do in Switzerland and in the UK today. So I think we have to take a little bit of a global view of what clinical trials are. They are not only made to put drugs on the market, they are also made to answer important questions for patients. So I think this is something we have to rethink. Again, we welcome, for instance, the new definition of minimal intervention clinical trial. But again, this is not going to address this important question about treatment optimization, which are at the heart of CPE, at the heart of EORTC, and that's why we have made this white paper. So again, methodology innovation is as important. Thank you.
Thank you. Apologies, I need to move this on a little bit so we still have time for questions. Pilar, briefly, we've heard from the non-commercial sector, we've heard from the patient perspective, and we've heard from Susan. From your point of view, what elements of the Biotech Act would make Europe more competitive as a place for clinical research and also keeping the opportunities for patients to participate?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. Thank you for the question. So I'll focus on one point that has a bit of what everybody has said. Innovation for us, especially at B1, we have a very large pipeline, as you probably know, is being able to bring more new drugs to more patients every year. So we've been actually doubling on new molecular entities on a year-by-year basis. And we've been actually increasing at the same time that the clinical trials were declining in Europe. We were actually increasing in the completely opposite direction. Innovation needs to be risk-based. And for us to be able to bring new molecular entities here, we need to have the right approach, as Dennis said, with regards to risk. Early clinical research is very different from late research. Early clinical research can be done in a smaller set of countries because you go faster, you need to find the dose, you need to actually provide with the clinical expertise. Late phase clinical trials need to be as wide as possible. In an environment like the one that we have today, that is very difficult. We have been lucky because we are nimble and we have managed to actually streamline our submissions, our RFIs, our startup, our contracting, we work on all these tiny little nitty-gritty operational aspects in order to go as fast as possible. But the Biotech Act has the capacity and the opportunity to make this easier for everybody. For bigger corporations, I am sure that this is a lot more difficult than for us. And that's why we're all suffering. And that's why everybody is or has been leaving Europe. We still believe that this is a great opportunity. Access is extremely important in the company. It's the pillar, right? Like the patient is at the center of everything that we do, and giving more patients to more drugs to more patients is the most important thing. So we're still investing here, but it comes at a very high cost, and it's extremely burdensome. So yeah, so just to stay brief, I think I would focus on that, and we have a great opportunity to do it with the changes that are coming. Even though I agree with a few of you, there's a few more things that will need to be addressed in order for its implementation to be successful. Yep.
Thank you. Almaz,
Yes.
I'm going to bring you in, and we actually already have a question from the audience from you, so I'm going to put that question to you, because in your early intervention, Almaz, you said that you talked about the challenges of things being unpredictable. So I think, and so you said, can you elaborate more on that? And I think that's a really good way to say, what are the policy changes that you would like to see that would have the greatest impact on strengthening Europe's biotechnology ecosystem? And presumably that's partly to do with the unpredictability. So can you answer our question from the audience and help us to understand what's on your top wish list for policy changes?
Absolutely. And the question, around predictability links to what Danny was saying as well, because we need fast, predictable timelines. We need to stop gold plating in terms of adding on, additional requirements at national level. But we also need to have a system in Europe that can accommodate, advancements in scientific methodologies, because that's one of the things when we're making decisions around, geostrategy for clinical trials. Okay, how quickly a region can move, and I'm thinking about early research here also. That's, I think, an area of huge opportunity for Europe, but also thinking about the capacity to accommodate more complex methodologies, because that is the direction, as Denny had said, and particularly in an area like oncology, where we're thinking about, platform studies, when we're thinking about development of precision medicines. And what would be not a good outcome for any of us is if we had an artificial acceleration that brought us quicker to approval, but what led to more conditional approvals, because that would delay site startup. So back to that patient waiting for the medicine, they're still going to be left waiting. So I think we need to look at both aspects. I think that's a really important point. So what would that require in policy terms? It does require more centralized coordination and reducing duplication, because the situation at the moment is we submit very similar from conceptual approach trials to different member states, and we get different answers, and that's very difficult for predictable drug development. So a more coordinated, consistent assessment model, clearer arrangements for substantial modifications, that we can do more in parallel. We need to remove those constraints. So really, to sum up, as the Irish presidency continues its work, our message would be to keep the shorter timelines, maintain a level of ambition, preserve the move towards more centralized and coordinated process, and really make sure that the Biotech Act delivers for the patients who cannot afford this delay. The framework needs to be fast, it needs to be flexible, and it needs to be genuinely patient-centred. And if we think about access, the clinical trial framework is going to be hugely important, but that will also need to be coupled with appropriate access policies at national level to make sure we really address that ultimate shared goal, which will require greater investment in innovation and policies at a national level that support that.
Thank you very much. And Jan, I'm going to bring you in a moment, but just I've already taken a look at the other question that we had submitted, and I think it's really pertinent to what we wanted to talk about, because we had a question in that said, an increase in clinical trials will improve access. Yes. But, can we also make sure that it's going to address the inequalities that Almaz has just spoken about and others, which is that in countries that, you don't have as much as infrastructure for trials, and therefore not access, how can we make sure that it's not just a few key countries that might benefit from us, but for Jan, for a patient's perspective, what would they notice in a difference in their experience if we get the Biotech Act? And that here I think we take the word patient as meaning all patients in all countries, even the smaller ones where you don't have lots of big university hospitals that could directly benefit from the Biotech Act.
Yeah, and I think Susan made a good point earlier about decentralization, and I think there is a lot that we could do around that. And the pandemic shone a spotlight on how people can actually find ways to make things happen during clinical trials. And in my personal experience, my drug was posted to me, and I was able to go locally and send on blood test results at that point. That was something that was not an option for me early on when I started my clinical trial, but certainly people found a way to be flexible. So I think when we're talking about equality across, it's never going to be entirely equal, is it? But if there's flexibility, maybe we can increase access for those populations who have a more of a logistical challenge.
Thank you very much. And we don't have any more questions that have been submitted, so that's great. It sounds to me like we have managed to address many issues in our conversation. So members of the panel, I've got sort of 2 or 3 minutes left, which means that I can give you each 30 seconds. Could you give me sort of one sentence that you would like us to leave with? We had the open invitation at the beginning from the MEPs who said, we want to make sure this delivers for patients and it's patient-centered. We've heard about the importance of things being streamlined, being flexible, being decentralized, making sure that we look at the whole pathway and the infrastructure. And also we heard from Jan, it's not just about the treatment itself, it's about the travel, it's about the psychosocial support, it's about the family. So everyone, I'd like you to think of just one sentence that would be our closing message to us all. So Jan, would you like to kick us off, because you're on screen and you're our patient? So
putting me on the spot, I guess I'm repeating the importance of everything, every discussion, every idea, every innovation being patient-centered. And I just wanted to bring in a little bit about, the altruism of patients who partake in clinical trials. The patients will happily donate blood samples, biobank samples. They'll happily share their medical data in the hopes of improving an experience for patients who come beyond them or after them. Mm-hmm. I think that needs to be rewarded just with our patient centricity. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Thank you. Alma, one sentence.
Our message to policymakers is simple. Keep the ambition for Europe high, make the system faster at scale, and really ensure that the Biotech Act delivers real-world patient benefit, because especially for oncology, the thing I take away from listening to everyone today is, time is not just process, it's access.
Pilar, thank you.
Sorry, unmuting. So made with Europe, not just in Europe, yeah? We don't live in an island. We need to work with the rest of the world. We are perceived as slow, complex, burdensome, administratively heavy. I would love to change that perception. We need to be on the game, and we need to be perceived as agile, fast, innovative, and patient-centric.
Thank you. Denis.
Yes, my message to the policymaker is think about an ecosystem for clinical trial where things are proportionate. Certainly, you are not going to do a phase 1 trial in a large number of countries and probably at selected sites, but there are trials which we can bring very easily to all patients in a decentralized manner, and this is complicated today. So think out of the box and make things, I would say, flexible enough so that we can achieve a continuum of clinical trial from early development to access, but which will cover completely I would say, the questions that we need to optimally give appropriate care to all patients.
Excellent. And finally, Susan, one sentence.
Thank you, Tamsin. My message to the policymakers is, please can we make sure that clinical trials in Europe are accessible for patients in Europe wherever those patients are living. Even if the trial is not able to be conducted at a site in their country, can we make sure that it is easy for them to access a trial at a site in another country so that we get some kind of equity in patient access to trials in Europe?
Excellent. Thank you very much. And members of the panel, thank you so much for sharing your insight, your experience, and you've set out for us both your hopes for the Biotech Act and how you think it could make an impact, and your call very much to policymakers to keep patients at the centre of it, to streamline, to address the complexity, to look at the equity issue and make sure that we look at the continuity of clinical research from phase 1 right down to implementation. So these are all really good messages. So now let me hand over to the CEO of Cancer Patients Europe, to Antonella, to give the closing remarks on today's webinar.
Thank you, Tamsin. And as we come to the end of this webinar, I would like to sincerely thank all of our speakers for sharing their expertise, perspectives, and experiences. Today's discussion has clearly demonstrated that Europe has an extraordinary opportunity in front of us. The Biotech Act has the potential to strengthen Europe's position as a global leader in biotechnology and clinical research. But its success will ultimately be measured not only by the innovation it generates, but by whether patients experience a faster, more equitable access to that innovation. One message has come through consistently today. Patients must be at the heart of this process. Building a stronger clinical trials ecosystem means making research more accessible, more inclusive, and better aligned with patients' needs and realities. It also requires continued collaboration across institutions, researchers, industry, healthcare professionals, and patient organizations. At Cancer Patients Europe, we remain committed to ensuring that the patient voice continues to contribute to these discussions as the Biotech Act develops. So the insights shared today will help inform our future policy work and our ongoing engagement with European policymakers and stakeholders. Thank you once again to all our speakers, to Tamsin for her excellent moderation of today's discussion, and to everyone who joined us online. And of course, a special thanks goes to our team at CPE who made this webinar possible. And we look forward to continue this important conversation in the months ahead. So thank you very much, and I wish all a wonderful day.